carving demonstration. Permanent maxillary right canine. 1.5-inch wax block is used for carving this tooth. From one end of the wax block, measure 10 mm using the metal scale and mark it using the wax carver. Then, draw lines parallel to the edge of the block on all the four surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This line corresponds to the cervical line of the tooth. The 10 mm part of the wax block is used for carving the crown part and the other part is used for carving the root. After demarcating the crown and the root, the individual surfaces are labelled on the root part of the wax block. This is the labial view, mesial view, palatal view and the distal view. For carving the labial surface and the palatal surface, draw the labial and the palatal outlines of the crown on the mesial side of the crown part. Similarly, draw the labial and the palatal outlines on the distal side. This labial outline should be convex in the middle and cervical third, and it should be flat in the incisal third level. The palatal outline should be convex in the cervical third, denoting the cingulum, and it should be concave in the middle and incisal third, denoting the fossa. That is, it should have an S-shaped outline. Now the labial surface is carved by slowly removing the wax on the labial aspect in the middle and incisal third, and thereby creating a smooth flat labial surface. Now, following the labial outline drawn on the proximal sides, the labial convexity in the cervical third is created by removing wax near the cervical line. This shows the carved labial outline. Next, the palatal surface is carved by removing the wax on the palatal aspect in the middle and the incisal third levels. The wax in this area should be removed more to create a concavity in the middle and incisal third, which will correspond to the palatal fossa. Now, by following the palatal outlines drawn on the proximal sides, the palatal convexity in the cervical third is created by removing the wax near the cervical line. This palatal convexity corresponds to the cingulum and should be smoothened and made prominent by deepening the concavity in the middle and the incisal thirds. This is the mesial aspect showing the carved labial and the palatal outlines of the crown. This is the distal aspect showing the carved labial and palatal outlines of the crown. Next, draw the proximal outlines on the labial and palatal surface of the crown. On the labial surface, draw the proximal outline starting from the mesio-incisal and the disto-incisal edge up to the cervical line to about 0.5 mm short of the edge of the block. Similarly, on the palatal surface, draw this proximal outline starting from the mesio-incisal and the disto-incisal edge up to the cervical line to about 1 mm short of the edge of the block. This 0.5 mm difference between the labial and the palatal surfaces corresponds to the palatal convergence of the crown. This is the labial and the palatal aspect showing the proximal outlines. Now, carve the proximal aspect by slowly removing the wax on the mesial surface starting from the mesio-labial edge and then moving towards the mesio-palatal edge. This is the labial view showing the carved mesial surface. Next, the distal surface is carved by slowly removing the wax starting from the disto-labial edge and then moving towards the disto-palatal edge. The carving of the proximal aspect is otherwise called as the proximal reduction, and this should follow the mesial and the distal outlines drawn on the palatal aspects. This is the labial view showing the carved proximal surfaces. Now, draw a line in the center of the crown on the labial surface extending from the marked cervical area up to the incisal aspect. Then, draw two lines extending onto the mesial and the distal sides like a heart on the incisal surface. The line on the labial surface corresponds to the canine ridge, and this should not be straight but convex with the convexity facing towards the mesial side. Now the canine ridge is carved by removing the wax on the mesio-labial surface starting from the canine ridge line up to the mesial side in a slanting manner. Similarly, the wax is removed on the distolabial surface starting from the canine ridge line up to the distal side. This shows the carved canine ridge. To carve the mesial and the distal cuspal slopes, two lines are drawn on the incisal third of the labial surface of the crown, extending from a point midway mesiodistally and ending up to the mesial and the distal outlines at the junction of the middle and incisal third. The cuspal slopes should be in such a way that the mesial slope should be short and the distal slope should be long. Now the cuspal slopes are carved by removing the wax near the incisal third by following the cuspal outlines. This is the labial aspect showing the carved canine cusp, cuspal slopes and the canine ridge. From the edge of the wax block, measure 27 mm using the metal scale and mark it using the wax cover, and then draw lines on all the four surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This line corresponds to the apex of the tooth. This is the labial aspect showing the marked measurement of the tooth. Now remove the excess wax exactly at the marked end of the line, which corresponds to the apex. This shows the correct length of the tooth. Next, draw the mesial and the distal outline of the root on the labial aspect of the root part. Similarly, draw the mesial and the distal outlines of the root on the palatal aspect. But this outline should be 0.5 mm less than the labial aspect. This 0.5 mm difference corresponds to the palatal convergence of the root. This is the labial showing the proximal root outlines. Now the proximal surface of the root is carved by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is how a completed proximal root outline should be on one side. Then the other proximal surface of the root is carved in a similar way by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. While carving the proximal outlines of the root, the carving should follow the outlines drawn previously on the labial and the palatal aspects. This is the labial showing the carved proximal outlines. Now draw the labial and the palatal outline of the root on the mesial aspect of the root part. Similarly, the labial and the palatal outlines of the root is drawn on the distal aspect. This is the mesial showing the labial and the palatal outlines of the root. Now, the labial surface of the root is carved by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. Then the palatal surface of the root is also carved in a similar way by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is the mesial showing the carved labial and palatal outlines of the root. Then, the cervical line is drawn on the labial, distal, palatal and mesial aspects. This is how the cervical line should be drawn on all the different aspects of the carved tooth. The cervical constriction is then carved by slowly removing wax from the crown towards the marked cervical line. This is done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. This is the labial, mesial, palatal and the distal aspect showing the carved cervical constriction. Next, the cervical constriction is carved by slowly removing wax from the root towards the marked cervical line. This is also done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. After carving the cervical constriction, the root part should be smoothened to remove any excess elevations. This is the labial, mesial, palatal, and the distal aspects showing the carved cervical constriction. Next, the distal curvature of the root is carved in the apical third by removing the wax in the apical third, thereby creating concavity. Then the root apex is rounded on all the sides. This is the labial aspect showing the distal curvature of the root. Next, in the palatal surface of the crown part, draw the outlines of the cingulum, palatal ridge, marginal ridges and the palatal fossae. This shows the palatal outline of the palatal surface of the crown. Now the palatal fossae are carved by slowly removing the wax from the fossae area. After carving the fossae, the palatal ridge, marginal ridges and the cingulum are rounded so that it merges with the fossae. By using the scooped end of the wax carver, the palatal fossae is carved accurately below the cingulum area. Then the cuspal slopes are rounded so that the canine cusp becomes prominent. This is the completed labial aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect and distal aspect. Preliminary polishing is done using the rough polishing cloth by rubbing gently on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. Then, the yellow polishing cloth is used for polishing by rubbing gently on all the surfaces. While using these polishing cloths, forceful rubbing should be avoided to prevent any changes in the contours of the carved tooth. Then, final polishing is done using either a cotton or a tissue paper dipped in soap water. After polishing in soap water, the carved tooth is dried using a tissue paper. This is the final labial aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect, distal aspect and incisal aspect of the permanent maxillary right canine. This shows the different stages of tooth carving up to the completed tooth.